For centuries, no one on earth could say where Troy had stood. The most famous city ever besieged, the city whose fall launched 1,000 poems, had simply vanished, its walls buried beneath grass and silence on a wind-swept hill in northwestern Turkey, 6 kilometers from the strait that once made it the gatekeeper of the ancient world. Shepherds grazed their flocks over it. Farmers ploughed its stones into their fields, and for generations scholars argued bitterly over whether it had ever existed at all. How does a city that burned so brightly in human memory disappear so completely from the earth? This is the complete story of Troy. Not a fragment, not a single famous war retold. This is the full life of a city, from the first rough stone walls raised on a defensible hill around 3,000 years before Christ, through 30 centuries of building, burning, rebuilding, and transformation, all the way to the moment a man with a shovel stood on that quiet mound and realized an entire civilization lay beneath his feet. You will witness why this particular ground was chosen, where the Scamander River fed a fertile plain and the narrow Dardanelles Strait funneled every ship sailing between the Aegean and the Black Sea past this single commanding hill. You will see the first Megaron halls with their central hearths, the monumental ramps and golden treasures of a citadel that flourished 1,000 years before any king named Priam could have lived. You will walk the towering limestone walls of Troy at its zenith, when Hittite emperors wrote its name in cuneiform on clay tablets and Mycenaean merchants carried painted pottery through its gates. You will stand inside crowded houses where families sank storage jars into their floors, preparing for a siege that ended in fire and ash. You will follow the centuries of silence that followed, when oral poets carried the memory of that destruction across generations, transforming history into legend, until Homer gave it the shape we still recognize. And you will watch as Greek colonists, Persian kings, Alexander the Great, and Roman emperors each came to this mound seeking the glory of a city already ancient in their time. Finally, you will see the rediscovery, the excavations that peeled back layer after layer, 10 cities stacked one upon another, each one a chapter in the longest urban biography the ancient world has left us. What makes Troy extraordinary is not merely the legend. It is the fact that beneath the legend, the stones are real. Arrowheads embedded in walls are real. A skeleton left unburied in a street, caught in the moment of destruction, is real. And the questions those stones raise have never been fully answered. Troy stands at the exact place where myth and archaeology meet, where a poem composed nearly 3,000 years ago can be tested against carbon dates and burn layers and the silent testimony of shattered mud brick. Without Troy, we would not understand how deeply the ancient world could remember, how faithfully oral tradition could preserve the echo of a catastrophe across 500 years of retelling. Without Troy, the science of archaeology itself would have matured differently, for it was here that scholars learned, sometimes painfully, that the earth keeps records more honest than any epic. If you value complete journeys through the great cities of the ancient world, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Each week we bring back to life a world built in mud brick, bronze, and stone. The story begins where it must with the ground itself, the hill above the strait, and the first people who looked at this place and understood what it could become. Before anything else, there is the water. The Dardanelles, that narrow corridor of current barely 7 kilometers wide at its tightest, funnels every vessel passing between the Aegean and the vast interior sea beyond. The strait runs northeast, and the prevailing winds blow from the same direction, forcing ancient ships to wait for calm or favorable gusts. They wait on the southern shore, where a low hill rises above a coastal plain fed by 2 rivers. The Scamander and the Simois carry snowmelt from the Ida Massif down through rich alluvial soil, spreading a broad floodplain of dark earth ideal for grain and grazing. The hill itself stands perhaps 15 meters above this plain, modest in height, commanding in position. From its crest one sees the strait's gleaming thread, the ships at anchor, the grain fields rippling in wind. This is Hisarlik. This is where Troy begins. Around 3,000 years before the Common Era, a community raises the first permanent walls on this ground. They are not the first people here. Scattered Neolithic traces suggest earlier, impermanent occupation. But they are the first builders. They cut rough limestone blocks from nearby outcrops, lay them as foundations a meter thick, and raise sun-dried mud brick courses above. The walls enclose a citadel perhaps 90 meters across, a compact fortified space overlooking the plain. This is Troy 1. Inside, the architecture follows a form already ancient in Anatolia, the megaron. A long rectangular hall, its entrance on the short side, a central hearth sending smoke upward through the roof timbers. The largest megaron at Troy 1 measures roughly 18 meters in length. Its beaten earth floor bears the residue of countless fires. Around the hearth, the air would have carried the smell of burning dung and wood, of grain being parched before grinding, of wool drying after washing in river water. The people of Troy 1 work copper and arsenical bronze, pins, flat axes, simple blades. They shape pottery by hand, without the wheel, producing dark, burnished vessels with angular profiles characteristic of Western Anatolian early Bronze Age traditions. Loom weights of baked clay appear in nearly every structure, evidence of textile production woven into daily routine. They keep sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. They harvest emmer wheat and barley from the plain below. Their walls are not decorative. The fortification circuit shows evidence of at least one rebuilding during this phase, the community reinforcing and thickening its defenses over generations. The threat is real. Other settlements dot the Troad, and control of the strait's anchorage means control of trade goods moving between worlds. Obsidian from central Anatolia, shell ornaments from the coast, copper from sources to the east, all pass through networks that converge at this narrows. Radiocarbon dates place Troy 1's founding around 3000 before the Common Era, and its end around 2550. 5 centuries of continuous occupation on one hill. Layer by layer, the debris of daily life, collapsed mud brick, ash from hearths, broken pottery, animal bone, raises the ground level. Each generation builds atop the compressed remains of the last. The mound grows. The logic of the location holds firm across every generation. Whoever commands this hill commands the passage between 2 seas. The strait demanded a city, and the city answered. Around 2550 before the Common Era, something shifts. The modest settlement atop Hisarlik does not simply grow, it transforms. What rises in its place over the next 2.5 centuries is a citadel of ambition unlike anything previously seen on this coast. Troy 2 is not an evolution, It is a declaration. The most striking feature greets any visitor approaching from the southwest. A monumental stone ramp, over 20 meters long and nearly 8 meters wide, ascending at a gentle gradient toward a roofed gateway flanked by heavy walls. The ramp's surface is paved with flat stones, worn smooth by generations of feet, hooves, and wooden wheels. This is not a defensive afterthought. It is architecture designed to impress, to announce that what lies beyond the gate commands respect. The gateway itself passes through a propylon, a formal entrance hall with wooden columns supporting a broad roof, channeling all movement through a single controlled passage into the citadel interior. Beyond the gate, the ground levels into a courtyard, and there stands Megaron 2A, the great hall at the heart of this phase. Its dimensions are remarkable for its age, roughly 30 meters long and nearly 14 meters wide, with thick mud brick walls rising from stone foundations. A central hearth dominates the interior floor, its clay surface fire-hardened and replastered many times over. Roof beams of timber span the width, supported by the massive walls themselves. Smoke rises through openings above. The hall's proportions anticipate the megaron form that will define Mycenaean palace architecture 1,000 years later. The metallurgy of Troy, too, reveals a community with access to sophisticated craft knowledge and distant raw materials. Copper, arsenical bronze, silver, electrum, and gold all appear in worked forms. Crucibles bear traces of high-temperature smelting. Cast bronze tools, flat axes, chisels, pins show standardized production. And then there are the treasures. In 1873, Heinrich Schliemann extracted from a deposit near the fortification wall a cache he triumphantly named the Treasure of Priam. Gold diadems, one assembled from over 16,000 individual gold rings and leaves, gold earrings, electrum sauce boats, silver vessels, copper lance heads, and bronze daggers. The assemblage is breathtaking, but it belongs here, to Troy too, dating roughly 2300 before the Common Era. It predates any possible Priam by a full millennium. Schliemann's era was romantic, but stratigraphically devastating. His workers tore through later layers to reach what he believed was Homer's city, destroying evidence that could never be recovered. The treasure itself speaks of concentrated wealth, long-distance exchange networks reaching sources of gold and silver, and a ruling authority capable of accumulating such surplus. Whether this represents a royal house, a priestly elite, or a mercantile dynasty remains unclear. What is certain is that Troy too controlled enough of the Strait's commerce to convert that geographic advantage into precious metal. The citadel of this phase encompasses roughly 9,000 square meters, modest by later standards, but densely built and heavily fortified. Multiple building phases show walls repaired, gates rebuilt, structures expanded. The community invests continuously in its own monumentality, and then it ends. The final stratum of Troy too is a thick destruction layer, deep deposits of ash, carbonized wood, collapsed mud brick reddened by intense heat. The fire that consumed this citadel was catastrophic and total. Whether enemy attack, accident, or earthquake-triggered conflagration caused it cannot be determined from the evidence alone. What is clear is the completeness of the burning. Roof timbers collapsed into rooms, mud brick walls vitrified in the heat. The treasure caches may have been buried by this very collapse, sealed beneath debris until Schliemann's pickaxe found them 38 centuries later. The citadel of gold burned, and its ashes became the foundation for what came next. Smaller, quieter centuries building slowly upward on the same stubborn hill. Above the ash and rubble of that catastrophic burning, life returns. Not grandly, not with monumental ramps or treasure hoards sealed in stone walls, but with the quiet persistence of people who know this hill, who understand its command of the strait and the plain, and who rebuild because the reasons for living here have not changed. The water still moves through the Dardanelles. The Scamander still feeds the fields. The hill still watches over everything. Troy 3 rises directly atop the destruction layer of its predecessor, and the contrast is immediate. Where Megaron halls once stretched across the citadel summit, now smaller mud-brick houses crowd together in tight clusters, their rooms modest, their walls thinner. The stone socles that support them are rougher, less carefully dressed. Hearths occupy the center of single-room dwellings, circular depressions lined with clay, blackened by years of cooking fires fueled by scrub oak and dried dung. The smell of wood smoke and roasting grain settles into every surface. These are not palaces. These are homes built for shelter, storage, and the steady rhythm of subsistence. The ceramic record tells the story most clearly. The fine wheel-made vessels and elegant deeper cups of Troy 2 give way to coarser, handmade forms. Cooking pots with thick walls and simple rims dominate the assemblages. Bowls for grinding and mixing replace the delicate drinking sets of the earlier citadel. The pottery is functional, undecorated, made for daily use rather than display or exchange. Trade connections have narrowed. The long-distance networks that once brought tin and gold and lapis lazuli to this hilltop have contracted, though they never disappear entirely. Yet continuity runs beneath the surface. Emmer wheat and barley remain the staple crops, their carbonized grains recovered from storage pits and floor deposits across every phase. Sheep and goat bones accumulate in refuse heaps alongside cattle and pig remains. Lentils appear. Figs appear. The agricultural foundation that sustained Troy 2 sustains Troy 3, 4, and 5 without interruption. The land does not forget how to feed a settlement, even a diminished one. Through Troy 4 and into Troy 5, spanning roughly 1800 to 1700 before the Common Era, the pattern holds. Each phase builds upon the compressed remains of the last. Floors are relaid over collapsed walls. New mud brick rises on old mud brick. The mound itself grows, not through ambition but through accumulation, the slow geological process of human habitation pressing layer upon layer into the earth. Archaeologists measuring the stratigraphic sections at Hisaluk can trace these centuries in bands of packed clay, ash lenses, and decomposed mud brick, each one representing a generation that lived, cooked, stored grain, repaired walls, and eventually left its debris for the next. Loom weights appear in consistent numbers throughout these phases, small clay objects, pyramidal or disc-shaped, perforated for suspension on a warp-weighted loom. Textile production continues as a fundamental domestic activity. Bronze tools remain in use, though fewer elaborate cast objects appear compared to the wealth of Troy 2, simple pins, needles, flat axes. The metallurgical knowledge persists, scaled to a community that needs tools more than it needs prestige goods. What is remarkable about these 6 centuries is not what happens, but what does not. The site is never abandoned. No gap appears in the stratigraphic record. No sterile soil layer separates one phase from the next. Through whatever disruptions ended each sub-phase, minor fires, structural collapse, simple decay, the inhabitants or their successors returned and rebuilt on the same ground. The geographic logic that placed a settlement here around 3000 before the Common Era remains irrefutable through every modest generation that follows. The mound grows taller. By the end of Troy 5, the accumulated debris of over 1,000 years of continuous occupation has raised the citadel summit several meters above its original bedrock. And it is upon this elevated platform, this compressed archive of centuries, that something new will arrive. A population bringing horses, massive limestone walls, and an architectural ambition that will surpass even the citadel of gold. But that transformation lies just ahead. For now, the hill simply endures, growing quietly upward under Anatolian sun, holding its position above the strait, waiting. Then the walls come. Not the rough stone footings of earlier centuries, not the modest mud-brick partitions that divided one cramped room from the next across 500 years of quiet habitation. These are walls of a different order entirely, massive, deliberate, engineered to command. Sometime around 1700 before the Common Era, the citadel of Hisarlik undergoes a transformation so thorough that archaeologists mark it as a clean break. Troy 6 rises on the accumulated platform of its predecessors, but it bears almost no resemblance to what came before. The new builders quarry pale limestone from the surrounding ridges and lay it in courses of ashlar masonry, so precisely fitted that the joints still hold after 3,500 years. The walls climb to heights that nothing on this mound has ever approached, standing in places to 5 meters even now, in ruin. They originally rose higher still, their upper courses of mud brick long since dissolved by rain and time. At their base, these fortifications reach 4 meters in thickness. They do not rise vertically. They lean inward with a characteristic battered slope, each course stepping slightly back from the one below, creating a profile that deflects force and resists scaling. This is not improvisation. This is military architecture of the highest Bronze Age standard. The builders construct the circuit wall not as a single continuous line, but in offset segments, each section slightly angled from the next, creating a subtle sawtooth pattern that eliminates blind spots and allows defenders to direct fire along the wall face. Monumental towers punctuate the circuit at strategic intervals. The south gate opens through a narrow passage flanked by massive stonework, forcing any approaching force into a confined corridor under observation from above. The east gate stands protected by a great tower, its entrance designed so that attackers must expose their unshielded right side as they advance. Within these walls, the citadel takes on an entirely new spatial order. Grand freestanding houses rise on concentric terraces cut into the hillside, their stone foundations supporting substantial upper stories. These are not the cramped, wall-sharing dwellings of Troy 3 or 4. They stand apart, each commanding its own ground, suggesting a social hierarchy expressed directly in stone and space. And with this new city come horses. The bones appear in quantities unknown from earlier layers, not wild animals hunted on the plain, but domesticated horses, bred and kept within or near the settlement. Their presence signals connections to the broader Anatolian interior, to populations moving westward with equestrian traditions, and perhaps with the knowledge of chariot warfare that is reshaping power across the Near East and Aegean in this same period. The pottery changes too. A distinctive Anatolian grey ware appears, wheel-made, thin-walled, burnished to a metallic sheen, its forms echoing shapes found across western Anatolia. This ceramic tradition speaks of cultural affiliations reaching deep into the peninsula rather than across the Aegean, though Mycenaean imports will soon appear alongside it in increasing numbers. The citadel that emerges over these 3 centuries is the most impressive structure the Troad has ever seen. From the sea approach, the battered limestone walls catch the late afternoon light and glow against the dark green of the Scamander plain. From the landward side, the offset wall segments and tower profiles create a silhouette of calculated strength. This is a city built to be seen, to announce control over the strait passage, the fertile lowland, and the trade routes converging at this narrow hinge between continents. The walls of Troy 6 still stand in the excavation trenches today, their pale stone rising above the jumbled remains of every phase that came before and after. They are the most visually commanding feature of the archaeological site, the moment when the settlement on Hizaluk ceased to be a fortified village and became, unmistakably, a city. Those walls now look out upon a world of empires. By 1400 before the Common Era, the city behind them has become something more than a regional stronghold commanding a strait. It has become a name written in cuneiform on clay tablets in the archives of Hattusa, the Hittite capital 500 kilometers to the east, deep in the Anatolian plateau. The name is Wilusa. The identification is not certain beyond all doubt, but the convergence of evidence is powerful. Hittite diplomatic texts from the 13th century before the Common Era reference a kingdom called Wilusa in the northwest corner of Anatolia, precisely where Troy stands. The linguistic progression from Wilusa to the Greek Wilion to Ilion follows established sound shift patterns, and one treaty in particular arrests attention: the agreement between the Hittite great king Muwatalli II and a ruler of Wilusa named Alexandru. That name echoes across the centuries, Alexandros, the alternative name Homer gives to Paris of Troy. The treaty itself, preserved on a tablet catalogued as KUB 21.1, reveals a vassal relationship. Wilusa acknowledges Hittite suzerainty, receives military protection, and in return provides loyalty and likely tribute. The gods invoked as witnesses include Kaskalkur, a deity of underground waterways, and beneath the citadel of Troy, archaeologists have found a system of subterranean water channels cut through limestone bedrock. The correspondence between text and ground is quietly remarkable. This is the diplomatic world Troy inhabits at its zenith. To the east, the Hittite Empire controls central Anatolia and contests power with Egypt. To the west, across the Aegean, the Mycenaean kingdoms of mainland Greece, referred to in Hittite texts as Ahiyawa, project commercial and perhaps military power along the Anatolian coast. Troy sits precisely at the hinge between these spheres, and the material evidence confirms it. Mycenaean pottery appears throughout the Troy 6 layers in significant quantities. Stirrup jars that once held perfumed olive oil, kylikes for drinking wine, small containers for precious unguents, all produced in the workshops of the Argolid or the Peloponnese and carried across the Aegean. The ceramic types correspond to Mycenaean 3A and 3B classifications, dating precisely to the 14th and 13th centuries before the Common Era. These are not rare curiosities. They constitute a meaningful percentage of the fine ware assemblage, indicating sustained and regular exchange rather than occasional contact. From Cyprus come copper oxhide ingots and distinctive pottery. From the east, tin, essential for bronze production, likely travels overland through Hittite-controlled territory or by sea from sources in Afghanistan via intermediary ports. Troy's position at the mouth of the Dardanelles means that any vessel moving between the Aegean and the Black Sea coast, where gold, timber, and grain await, must pass within sight of its walls. The city does not merely participate in late Bronze Age trade. It taxes it, facilitates it, controls the anchorage where ships wait for favorable winds and current to carry them through the strait. The citadel in this period holds grand freestanding houses with stone foundations, pillar houses, archaeologists call them. Their upper stories likely timber-framed, their interiors plastered and perhaps painted. Beyond the citadel walls, the lower town spreads across the gentle southern slope, its extent only fully understood after Kaufmann's geophysical surveys revealed streets, structures, and a defensive ditch enclosing perhaps 30 hectares. This is not a chieftain's fortress. This is an urban center of several thousand souls embedded in the international system of the late Bronze Age, corresponding with kings, receiving envoys, storing grain and bronze and oil against the uncertainties of a world held together by treaties written on clay. The tablets at Hattusa mention Wilusa in contexts of conflict too, border disputes, military threats from neighboring Azawa lands, appeals for Hittite intervention. The city lives within a web of obligation and danger. Its great walls are not merely symbolic. They are functional insurance in a world where alliance structures can fracture without warning, where a distant king's death can redraw the map of obligation overnight. The name Wilusa, scratched into wet clay by a Hittite scribe, preserves what Homer would later sing, that this city mattered, that empires knew its name, that its fate concerned the powerful of the earth. But the citadel is not the city. For generations, the towering limestone walls with their elegant batter dominated every understanding of this place, a fortified acropolis, a seat of rulers, a compact stronghold on a hill. The lower slopes and the plain beyond seemed empty, agricultural, peripheral. That understanding was wrong. Beginning in 1988, the German archaeologist Manfred Kaufmann launched a new campaign at his Saarluk that would fundamentally reshape what Troy meant. His team brought tools that Schliemann and Blegen never possessed: magnetometry, electrical resistivity surveying, systematic coring, instruments that could read the buried ground without breaking it open. And what the ground revealed was startling. Extending south and east of the citadel, beneath centuries of alluvial sediment and plough-disturbed soil, lay the unmistakable signature of dense human occupation covering approximately 30 hectares. Streets, structures, pits, walls, an entire lower town, invisible on the surface, preserved in the magnetic memory of the earth. The geophysical surveys mapped linear anomalies consistent with house walls, open areas suggesting courtyards or small plazas, and concentrations of fired material indicating workshops where bronze was cast or ceramics were fired. Targeted excavation confirmed what the instrument suggested. Occupation layers from the 13th century before the Common Era yielded loom weights by the dozen, animal bones from butchering, storage vessels, and the compacted surfaces of beaten earth floors worn smooth by daily use. This was not overflow from the citadel. This was a functioning urban quarter with its own rhythm and density. Most remarkable was the defensive system protecting it. A rock-cut ditch, roughly 2 meters deep and 3 to 4 meters wide, traced a broad arc around the lower town's southern perimeter. Behind it, post holes indicated a wooden palisade, not stone, not monumental, but sufficient to channel attackers, slow cavalry, and define the city's outer boundary. The ditch was no natural feature. Its V-shaped profile and consistent dimensions across hundreds of meters of traced length spoke of organized labor, centralized planning, a community that understood siege logic. The implications were profound. Troy was no longer a modest hilltop fortress, housing a few hundred elite residents. Population estimates climbed to between 5,000 and 10,000, a substantial Bronze Age city by any Mediterranean standard, comparable to contemporary settlements across the Hittite world and the Aegean. The citadel remained the administrative and ceremonial heart, its grand freestanding houses sheltering the ruling families, its walls projecting authority visible from the strait. But the life of the city, the weaving, the metalworking, the grain processing, the animal husbandry, the daily commerce that sustained thousands, unfolded below, in streets that wound between mud-brick houses roofed with timber and packed earth. Kaufmann's discovery ignited fierce academic debate. Some scholars questioned whether the lower town represented continuous, dense occupation or merely scattered extramural activity. The magnetometry data, they argued, could be read more conservatively. But successive excavation seasons reinforced the urban interpretation. The density of finds, the coherence of the defensive ditch, the sheer volume of domestic debris, all pointed toward a settlement far larger than the citadel alone. Standing on the mound today, looking south across the plain where the lower town once spread, the eye sees only grass and farmland. The wooden palisade rotted millennia ago. The mud-brick walls dissolved back into the earth from which they were formed. But beneath that quiet surface, the magnetic map preserves the ghost of a city, its streets still legible, its boundaries still defined, its workshops still marked by the iron signatures of ancient fire. The citadel rises behind, its limestone walls catching the afternoon light. Together, Acropolis and Lower Town, they formed a city worthy of the name Wilusa, worthy of the treaties, the trade, and the war that would one day consume it. Within those walls, in the decades around 1300 before the Common Era, a city breathes. Not the city of legend, not yet, but a city of grain and grease smoke, of clattering looms and bleating animals, of sweat and stone dust and the particular smell of bread baking on a clay hearth. The archaeology of daily life is quieter than the archaeology of destruction, but it is no less eloquent. What the excavations of Blegen and Kaufmann recovered from the floors and refuse pits of late Troy, Six tells the story of a community fed, clothed, armed, and organized with considerable sophistication. The diet begins in the fields of the Scamander Plain. Carbonized seeds recovered from storage rooms and cooking areas identify emmer wheat and barley as the staple grains, supplemented by lentils, bitter vetch, and figs. The plain's alluvial soils, renewed by seasonal flooding, supported reliable harvests. Animal bones tell the rest. Sheep and goat predominate, their meat roasted or stewed, their milk and wool equally essential. Cattle appear in significant numbers, suggesting plough agriculture and perhaps the wealth display of large herds. Fish bones, some from species found in the Dardanelles Strait, confirm that the sea's proximity was exploited, the cold current carrying mackerel and tuna within reach of net and line. On the citadel, grand freestanding houses with stone foundations and mud brick upper stories rise 2 or more levels. Their rooms are spacious, their floors beaten earth kept clean. Below in the lower town, dwellings crowd more tightly, walls thinner, rooms smaller, storage space carved from every available corner. The hierarchy is architectural. Those who lived on the citadel commanded views of the strait and the plain. Those below lived in the city's productive heart. Textile production dominates the material record. Hundreds of loom weights, fired clay, pyramidal or discoid, many bearing simple incised marks, have been recovered across the site. Their distribution suggests weaving occurred in nearly every household, but concentrations in certain lower town structures hint at workshop-scale production. The wool came from the flocks grazing the plain. The finished cloth may have travelled far. Textiles were among the most traded commodities of the late Bronze Age, lightweight and valuable, ideal cargo for the ships passing through the strait. Bronze working left its own signature. Crucible fragments, slag, and finished objects, pins, needles, chisels, knife blades, spear points, document a community that cast and cold-worked copper-tin alloy with practiced skill. The tin itself had to be imported, likely from sources far to the east, passing through Hittite-controlled trade networks. Every bronze blade in Troy carried within it the reach of the wider world. Religious life remains harder to read. No monumental temple has been identified in this phase, but small figurines, ritual deposits of animal bones, and possible cult installations within domestic spaces suggest worship woven into the fabric of daily routine rather than concentrated in a single sacred precinct. The divine was close, domestic, embedded in the threshold and the hearth. The cooking installations themselves, clay-lined hearths, portable braziers, stone-built ovens, anchor the sensory world. Emmer wheat ground on saddle querns, the rhythmic scraping of stone on stone audible across courtyards at dawn. Barley porridge thickened over low flame. Meat fat rendering in shallow ceramic vessels. The smell of burning olive wood and dried dung fuel hanging in still morning air. Loom weights clicking softly as the warp threads held taut under their pull. This is the city that the later centuries would remember as a place worth besieging, not for its gold alone, but for the accumulated wealth of grain stores and textile stocks, of bronze and livestock, and command over the strait's passage. The stones record no single dramatic moment here. They record instead the slow, dense accumulation of ordinary life. 10,000 meals, 10,000 bolts of cloth, 10,000 mornings when the light came over the Aegean and fell across floors worn smooth by generations of bare feet. And then the ground moves. Sometime around 1250 before the Common Era, the earth beneath those magnificent limestone walls shifts with catastrophic force. The The geology of northwestern Anatolia has always carried this threat. The North Anatolian fault system runs not far to the east, and the Troad sits within a zone of recurring seismic activity. Now that latent violence arrives without warning. The evidence is written in stone. Along the eastern fortification circuit, massive ashlar blocks that once stood in precise alignment are found displaced laterally, shoved from their bedding as if struck by an immense horizontal force. Wall segments that rose 5 meters and more now lean, crack, and in places collapse entirely. The characteristic battered slope that gave Troy 6 its architectural elegance buckles where the foundation courses shift beneath it. Inside the citadel, the grand freestanding houses, those proud structures with their stone socles and heavy mud brick superstructures, suffer catastrophic structural failure. Roofing timbers snap. Upper stories pancake downward. Walls split along their mortar joints and spill rubble across beaten earth floors. Carl Blegen, excavating this transition layer in the 1930s, recognized the pattern. The damage was not consistent with military assault. No fire accompanied the initial destruction, no arrowheads lodged in the fallen masonry. The pattern of collapse, lateral displacement of wall courses, vertical settling of heavy superstructures, radial cracking, pointed to seismic origin. The great walls of Troy 6 did not fall to an army. They fell to the earth itself. But the people survived, and this is what makes the transition to Troy 7A so remarkable. There is no gap in occupation, no abandonment layer of wind-blown soil or accumulated debris suggesting years of emptiness. The same population, their ceramic traditions unbroken, their material culture continuous, immediately begins to rebuild. They patch the fractured fortification walls, filling gaps with smaller stones and reused blocks that lack the careful dressing of the original masonry. The repairs are visible to this day in the excavated circuit, rough fieldstone plugging wounds in ashlar elegance. Inside the citadel, the transformation is more profound. The spacious freestanding houses of Troy 6, with their generous floor plans and open courtyards, are subdivided into smaller, tighter units. Partition walls carve grand rooms into cramped compartments. Every available space within the fortification perimeter is now occupied. And into the floors of these crowded dwellings, the inhabitants sink large storage vessels, pithoi, some standing nearly as tall as a person, their mouths flush with the floor surface, their bellies buried in the earth beneath. Blegen's excavations documented dozens of these sunken jars, clustered so densely in some rooms that little floor space remained for living. This is not normal domestic storage. This is stockpiling. The sheer volume of embedded pithoi, designed to hold grain, olive oil, dried provisions, suggests a population anticipating prolonged isolation. A community that has watched its great walls crack and patched them back together, now prepares for a different kind of threat. The earthquake shattered their confidence in stone. The pithoi speak of a city that fears siege. The crowding tells the same story. People from the lower town appear to have moved inside the repaired citadel walls, compressing the population into a defensible core. The architectural generosity of Troy 6, its sense of ordered space and civic dignity, gives way to the urgent pragmatism of Troy 7A. Every square meter must serve survival. The walls still stand, patched and scarred. The gates still function. The citadel still commands the plain, and the distant glint of the strait. But the city that rebuilds itself after the earthquake is a different place, denser, more anxious, its floors honeycombed with buried provisions. It is a city that knows something is coming. The stones of Troy 7a do not record what that something was. They record only the preparation, the quiet, determined work of a population turning its wounded citadel into a fortress meant to endure whatever arrives next across the Scamander plain. Whatever arrives comes with fire. The archaeological record does not narrate a siege. It does not count the days or name the attackers. What it preserves is an ending, sudden, violent, and total. Sometime around 1180 before the Common Era, the citadel that had braced itself with sunken storage jars and crowded subdivisions meets the catastrophe it feared. The destruction layer of Troy 7a is unmistakable in excavation, a thick band of charred mud brick, fire reddened to deep orange and black, carbonized roof beams collapsed across floors, ash compacted into dense strata that speak of temperatures intense enough to vitrify clay. This is not the gradual decay of abandonment. This is conflagration. Carl Blagen's excavations in the 1930s exposed the burn layer across the citadel with meticulous care, recording its depth, its color, its contents. Within that destruction horizon lie the signatures of violence, bronze arrowheads of types consistent with late Bronze Age Aegean warfare, smooth stone sling bullets scattered in streets and against walls, the detritus of assault. And in one narrow lane between ruined houses, Blagen's team uncovered something that no earthquake or accidental fire explains: an unburied human skeleton, partial, lying where it fell among the debris. No grave cut, no funerary arrangement. A body left in the open as the city burned around it. The pythos jars sunk into floors, those careful provisions stored against crisis, sit shattered in the wreckage, their contents consumed or scattered. The thick mud brick walls that had been patched after the earthquake now collapse inward under heat so fierce that their clay fabric transforms. Carbonized grain, the residue of storerooms, mingles with fallen roofing material. The destruction is comprehensive. No quarter of the excavated citadel escapes it. Radiocarbon dates from carbonized material within this layer cluster around 1180 before the Common Era, placing the event squarely within the decades of the broader Late Bronze Age collapse, that cascading failure of interconnected palace economies stretching from Mycenaean Greece through Hittite Anatolia to the Levant and Egypt. The Hittite capital at Hattusa burns in these same decades. Mycenaean palatial centers at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos fall or contract violently. Ugarit on the Syrian coast is destroyed and never reoccupied. The entire network of diplomatic exchange, tin trade, and royal correspondence that sustained the Bronze Age world unravels within a single generation. Troy 7a perishes within this wider catastrophe. Whether Mycenaean Greeks, the Ahiawa of Hittite texts, besieged and sacked this city as later Greek tradition insists, the archaeological evidence alone cannot confirm. The arrowheads are consistent with Aegean types, but not exclusively so. The sling bullets carry no ethnic signature. The fire could result from any attacker or from multiple causes compounding in a world where trade has ceased and alliances have dissolved. What the stones confirm is destruction by human violence, not earthquake, not accident, but assault followed by burning. The strait still glints beyond the plain. The Scamander still carries snowmelt toward the sea. But the city that commanded this crossing for generations lies under ash. The grand limestone walls of Troy 6, already earthquake-damaged and patched, now stand as blackened shells above carbonized interiors. The lower town beyond the defensive ditch, that sprawling settlement Kaufmann would later reveal, shows no continuation into the next phase at its former scale. The population that prepared so carefully, that sank its grain jars deep and crowded its families into subdivided rooms, is gone. Scattered, killed, enslaved, fled, the record does not say. What remains is silence, and a burn layer roughly half a meter thick in places, sealed beneath the slow accumulation of later centuries. It will wait more than 3,000 years for excavators to cut through it and read what the fire wrote into the earth, a single devastating sentence preserved in reddened clay and carbonized wood and scattered bone. This city fell, and fell in flames. The fire cools, rain falls on the shattered mud brick. Seasons turn across the ruined citadel, and wind carries dust into the empty rooms where Pythoi once stood sunk into beaten earth floors. Within a generation, grass covers the burn layer. Within a century, the great limestone walls of the citadel, still standing in places too massive for scavengers to dismantle entirely, become landmarks without a living city around them. The mound at Hisarlik enters a long twilight. The archaeological record for the decades immediately following the destruction of Troy 7A is thin. Some occupation continues. Troy 7B shows small groups resettling portions of the citadel, their handmade pottery marking them as culturally distinct from the population that perished or fled. But the city as a functioning urban organism, the city of thousands with its lower town and defensive ditch and trade connections stretching from Hattusa to Mycenae, that city is finished. The strait still glints in the distance, ships still pass, but the gatekeeper is gone. And yet something survives that no fire can reach. Somewhere in the Aegean world, itself collapsing, its palaces burning, its scripts falling silent, memory persists. Not written memory. The Linear B tablets of Mycenaean Greece recorded grain inventories and chariot counts, not epic narrative. What carries the story of a burning city forward is the human voice. Oral poetry in the Greek tradition operates through formulaic composition. Fixed phrases, rosy-fingered dawn, wine-dark sea, swift-footed Achilles, serve as building blocks that allow a trained singer to compose and recompose vast narratives in performance. Milman Parry demonstrated in the 1930s, through fieldwork with living oral poets in the Balkans, that this technique could sustain complex stories across generations without writing. Each performance is both repetition and reinvention. The core events persist. The details shift, amplify, crystallize. Across roughly 5 centuries, from approximately 1180 to 700 before the Common Era, the memory of a great siege at a city near the Hellespont passes through hundreds, perhaps thousands, of such performances. Historical specificity dissolves. The storage jars sunk into floors, the earthquake-patched walls, the arrowheads embedded in mud brick, these particulars vanish. What replaces them is something larger, divine intervention, heroic duels, a war lasting 10 years, a wooden horse. The city acquires a king named Priam, a prince named Hector, a stolen queen. The attackers become 1,000 ships. What is remarkable is not the transformation but the persistence. The Iliad, when it reaches written form around 750 to 700 before the Common Era, composed in the new Greek alphabet borrowed from Phoenician script, preserves details that no poet of the 8th century could have invented. The boar's tusk helmet described in the 10th book of the Iliad matches helmets known only from Mycenaean contexts, centuries before Homer. The catalogue of ships reflects a political geography that belongs to the Bronze Age, not the Iron Age world of the poet. The great tower of Ilios, the Scaean Gate, the broad streets, these echo a city that archaeology would eventually confirm existed in something like the form the poem remembers. Yet the poem is not history. It is the residue of history passed through the transforming medium of oral art. The mound itself, during these centuries, knows nothing of the song being shaped around its memory. Sparse settlements come and go. Geometric period Greek pottery appears in small quantities, suggesting occasional visitors or modest habitation, but no city rises. The stones wait in silence while, across the Aegean, singers give them voices they never possessed, and a fame that will outlast every empire that ever claimed them. By the time the Iliad is fixed in written Greek, the real city has been ash and grass for nearly 500 years. The poem becomes the city's afterlife, more enduring than limestone. But the mound does not remain empty. Even as the poem takes shape far across the water, the hill itself receives new inhabitants, people who carry no memory of the city that burned, who know nothing of Mycenaean palace culture or Hittite diplomacy, who arrive with different hands and different clay. Within decades of the Great Fire, perhaps even sooner, small groups resettle the ruined citadel. Their pottery tells the story their voices cannot. Alongside the surviving late Bronze Age ceramic tradition, a new form appears. Coarse, handmade vessels with distinctive knob-like protrusions on their surfaces. Archaeologists call this knobbed ware, and its presence at Troy 7b marks a cultural rupture. These are not the descendants of the citadel's former elite rebuilding their grandparents' city. They are newcomers, likely from southeastern Europe or the Balkans, part of the vast population movements that accompanied the late Bronze Age collapse across the entire eastern Mediterranean. They occupy the same ground, reuse the same walls where walls still stand, but they inhabit a diminished world. The great trade networks have severed. Mycenaean pottery no longer arrives. The international system that once connected this strait to Egypt, Cyprus, and Hattusa has dissolved. Troy 7b persists through several sub-phases across roughly 2 centuries. The settlement shrinks, grows modestly, shifts its character. Phrygian cultural influence becomes detectable, grey burnished pottery replacing the earlier knobbed ware, new building techniques, a slow reorientation toward the Anatolian interior rather than the Aegean sea routes. The mound accumulates another meter of occupation debris. Life continues, but without grandeur. Then, sometime around 700 before the Common Era, precisely when the Homeric poems achieve their written form, Greek settlers arrive. They establish a community they call Ilion, deliberately claiming continuity with the legendary city. This is Troy 8. A modest polis takes shape on the ancient mound, its inhabitants fully aware they walk on storied ground. They construct a temple to Athena on the citadel's summit, placing their goddess exactly where Bronze Age structures once stood. The temple is not grand by the standards of mainland Greece, but its location carries immeasurable symbolic weight. Every stone laid here is a claim upon the epic past. Greek Ilion trades on its fame. Visitors come, not merchants seeking tin or textiles, but pilgrims seeking the landscape of poetry. They look out across the Scamander plain and imagine chariots. They touch old walls and believe they touch the work of gods. The city becomes a living monument to its own mythology, modest in population and political power, but extraordinary in cultural resonance. In 480 before the Common Era, the Persian king Xerxes pauses here on his march toward Greece. Herodotus records that he ascends to the citadel of Priam, surveys the plain, and sacrifices 1,000 cattle to Athena of Ilion. The gesture is political theatre, a great king honoring a city destroyed by the Greeks he now intends to conquer. But it confirms Ilion's status as a recognized sacred site, a place where even empires pause to acknowledge the weight of the past. For the next century and a half, Ilion remains small, governed by its own council, minting occasional coins, maintaining Athena's temple, receiving visitors who come to see where legend touched earth. The city possesses no army of consequence, no fleet, no walls worthy of the name. Its power is entirely memorial. It exists because the poem exists, and because human beings cannot resist walking the ground where stories were born. The stones of the Bronze Age citadel, buried now beneath Greek foundations, wait unknowing beneath the feet of pilgrims who seek exactly what lies hidden below them. The real city they will never reach, separated from them not by distance, but by time. In the spring of 334 before the Common Era, a young Macedonian king crosses the Hellespont with an army of 40,000 and turns south before engaging a single Persian soldier. He comes first to Ilion. According to Plutarch, Alexander anoints himself with oil, runs naked with his companions to the supposed tomb of Achilles, lays a wreath there, and calls the hero blessed for having Homer as his herald. Inside Athena's temple, he dedicates his own armor and takes down from the walls a sacred shield said to date from the age of heroes. He carries that shield into battle at the Granicus days later. The gesture is calculated and sincere in equal measure. Alexander does not merely visit Troy, he claims it. He declares himself heir to Achilles, and in doing so, he binds the Homeric past to his own imperial future. He promises to rebuild Ilion as a great city. He does not live long enough to fulfill that promise, but his successors remember it. Lysimachus, who inherits control of western Anatolia after Alexander's death, funds the construction of a new temple of Athena Ilias on the citadel, a Doric structure raised directly over Bronze Age foundations, its marble drums resting on ground that still holds the carbonized debris of the destruction layer from 1,000 years before. The temple becomes the center of a regional religious league, the koinon of Athena Ilias, linking cities across the Troad in shared festival and sacrifice. Ilion grows modestly but steadily, its streets now following a planned grid, its civic identity anchored to the temple precinct above. Then Rome reaches eastward, and Troy's mythic gravity shifts to serve a new empire. Roman tradition, crystallized in Virgil's Aeneid, but rooted in much older claims, holds that Aeneas fled burning Troy, carrying his father and the sacred household gods, eventually reaching Italy to found the line that would produce Romulus. Julius Caesar traces his own Julian lineage to Aeneas's son Iulus. When he visits Ilion, He grants the city tax exemptions and expanded territory. Augustus, his adopted heir, continues the patronage with greater resources. A major rebuilding program transforms the small Hellenistic town into a proper Roman city, Troy the Ninth, in archaeological terms. The Temple of Athena receives new marble embellishments. A bouleuterion rises for civic assembly. Roman baths appear, fed by aqueducts channeling water from the foothills. A paved street system overlays the older Greek plan. Strabo, writing in the age of Augustus, describes Ilion as a city of modest size but extraordinary prestige, noting that Roman generals and emperors consistently honor it as the motherland of Rome itself. The irony is architectural. Roman marble columns stand on foundations that reach down through Greek, Phrygian, and Bronze Age layers, each generation building atop the compressed memory of its predecessors without knowing what lies beneath its own flaws. In the 2nd century of the Common Era, the Emperor Hadrian visits and funds further construction, an Odeon for musical performances, additional public buildings, repairs to the temple precinct. Inscriptions carved in his honor join those of Augustus and earlier benefactors, their Latin letters cut into stone that overlooks the same Scamander plain where Bronze Age farmers once harvested emmer wheat. The city at this moment is comfortable, provincial, well-maintained. It possesses a theatre, baths, temples, colonnaded streets. It hosts festivals. It receives tourists, Roman citizens who come to see the plain where Hector fell, to touch the walls they believe Priam defended, to stand where gods once walked among mortals. None of them dig. None of them suspect that the Troy they seek lies not around them, but beneath them, compressed into meters of stratified earth under their sandaled feet. The real walls of the Bronze Age citadel, the fire-reddened mud brick, the shattered pithoi, the arrowheads and sling bullets, all of it rests in darkness below Roman pavement, silent and complete, waiting for a future that neither Rome nor its poets can imagine. The Roman city does not fall in a single catastrophe. It diminishes. Through the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, Ilion contracts slowly, like a body losing warmth. The great temple of Athena, rebuilt so many times across 1,000 years, loses its cult function as Christianity spreads through the province of Asia. Imperial patronage ceases. The colonnaded streets crack where tree roots press upward through the pavement. The theatre seats fewer audiences each decade. The baths grow cold. Yet the settlement persists. Ecclesiastical records confirm that Ilion becomes a bishopric, a seat of Christian authority, however modest. Bishops from Ilion attend church councils in the 4th and 5th centuries, their signatures preserved in conciliar documents. A small Christian community worships somewhere on or near the ancient mound, perhaps reusing Roman stonework for a basilica. But the population thins. The harbour silts further. The Scamander plain, once managed by organized irrigation, reverts to marsh in places. Trade routes that once funneled goods through the Dardanelles now bypass this shore entirely. By the 7th and 8th centuries, the settlement barely registers in Byzantine administrative records. The bishopric continues nominally, but the physical community dwindles to a village, then perhaps to scattered farmsteads. Sometime around the 12th or 13th century, even this residual occupation ceases. The last inhabitants depart, taking what portable stone and timber they can carry. Local builders quarry the Roman marble for lintels and thresholds in nearby villages. The dressed limestone blocks of Troy's Bronze Age walls, still partially visible, become convenient building material for Ottoman-era farmhouses and field boundaries. The mound settles into silence. Grass covers the Roman pavement. Soil accumulates in the theatre's cavea. Wildflowers bloom where the Megaron hearths once burned. Shepherds graze flocks across the gentle rise, without knowing what lies compressed beneath their feet. 3,000 years of human ambition packed into barely 20 meters of stratified earth. The name Hisarlik, meaning simply place of fortresses, clings to the hill in local Turkish usage, a faint echo of what the ground remembers. Meanwhile, the literary Troy, Homer's Troy, burns brighter than ever in European imagination. Scholars, travelers, and antiquarians arrive in the Troad seeking the legendary city. But they look in the wrong places. In 1785, Jean-Baptiste Le Chevalier publishes his influential identification of Troy with the heights of Bunabashi, a site 8 kilometers south of Hisarlik, where springs emerge from the hillside. He counts the springs, compares them to Homer's description of hot and cold sources near the city, and declares the matter settled. European scholarship largely accepts this for decades. Others propose Alexandria Troas, the grand Hellenistic port city visible in impressive ruins along the coast, as the true location. The modest grass-covered mound of Hisarlik attracts little serious attention. The irony is precise. The actual city, its walls, its treasures, its burn layers, its dead, lies beneath farmland, unmarked and unexcavated, while scholars debate locations kilometers away. Pottery sherds litter the surface of Hisarlik. Exposed wall faces peek from eroded slopes. But without systematic investigation, these clues remain illegible. The mound keeps its secret through the long Ottoman centuries, through wars and treaties, and the slow turning of agricultural seasons on the Scamander plain. Wind moves across the rise. The strait glints to the north, unchanged since the first settlers chose this ground 5,000 years earlier. The geographic logic remains: the defensible hill, the fertile plain, the narrow water passage, but no city occupies it now. Only the compressed earth holds the record, layer upon layer of foundation stone and ash, gold and bone, ceramic and carbonized grain, all waiting in darkness for the moment when someone will finally cut into this hill and force it to speak. That moment arrives in the 1860s. Frank Calvert, a British consular official who has lived in the Troad for years, already owns part of the Hisarlik mound. He has dug exploratory trenches, found Bronze Age pottery and ancient walls, and become convinced that this modest hill, not the dramatic heights of Bunabashi favored by most scholars, conceals the ruins of ancient Troy. But Calvert lacks the funds for a full excavation. He shares his conviction with a wealthy German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann, who visits the site in 1868 and immediately commits his fortune to proving Homer's city real. Schliemann begins major excavations in 1871. His method is blunt: a massive trench driven straight through the center of the mound, north to south, cutting through millennia of accumulated habitation in the pursuit of the deepest, oldest layers. Workers with picks and shovels remove thousands of cubic meters of earth. Walls from later periods, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, are demolished or discarded as irrelevant overburden. Schliemann seeks the city of Priam, and he believes it lies at the bottom. By 1873, he reaches the burnt destruction layer of Troy 2 Ars, a city destroyed by fire around 2300 before the Common Era, and declares it Homeric Troy. On a June morning that year, he claims to discover a cache of gold and electrum objects packed together near the fortification wall. Gold diadems, earrings, bracelets, a gold sauce boat, copper and silver vessels, bronze weapons. He names it the Treasure of Priam. The announcement electrifies Europe. Troy is real, the treasure proves it, and Schliemann is its discoverer. But the identification is wrong by 1,000 years. The treasure belongs to the early Bronze Age, centuries before any Mycenaean Greek could have sailed against these walls. Schliemann's Great Trench, still visible today as a brutal scar across the mound, has destroyed irreplaceable stratigraphy, cutting through the very layers that might have answered the questions he claimed to pursue. Wilhelm Dörpfeld, a trained architect who joins Schliemann's later campaigns and continues after Schliemann's death in 1890, brings disciplined method to the chaos. Working through the 1890s, Dörpfeld identifies Troy 6, with its towering limestone walls, its battered slopes, its grand freestanding houses, as the true candidate for a Homeric-era city. The monumental fortifications match a late Bronze Age date. The Mycenaean pottery found within its levels places it squarely in the 13th century before the Common Era. Dörpfeld's correction reframes everything. The city Schliemann destroyed to reach his treasure was itself built over the ruins of earlier settlements and buried beneath the very walls that might correspond to epic memory. The treasure itself travels to Berlin, displayed in the Museum für Völkerkunde. During the Second World War, it vanishes, presumed destroyed in the bombing. For nearly 50 years it remains lost. Then, in 1993, Russian authorities confirm what scholars had long suspected. The Red Army seized the collection in 1945. The gold diadems, the electrum vessels, the copper daggers, all survive in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, where they remain today, contested between nations, separated forever from the stratigraphic context that might have told their full story. What Schliemann's trench reveals, despite its violence, is the fundamental truth of Hisarlik. This is a deeply layered site, city built upon city, destruction upon rebuilding, spanning thousands of years. The damage cannot be undone. But the questions it forces open, about method, about stratigraphy, about the relationship between text and earth, will shape every excavation that follows on this mound. The questions Schliemann forced open find their most disciplined answer in 1932, when Carl Blegen of the University of Cincinnati arrives at Hisarlik with a team trained in the stratigraphic methods that have transformed Near Eastern archaeology. Where Schliemann dug with the urgency of a treasure hunter, Blegen proceeds with the patience of a surgeon. Over 7 seasons, ending in 1938, his team maps every layer with unprecedented precision, recording pottery sequences, architectural phases, and destruction horizons centimeter by centimeter. The result is a definitive stratigraphy that identifies 46 distinct subphases across the mound's long life. Most critically, Blegen isolates Troy 7A as the layer bearing unmistakable signs of violent destruction. Fire-reddened mud brick, scattered arrowheads, the crowded pathos floor houses of a population bracing for siege, nay, and dates this destruction to approximately 1180 before the Common Era. If any historical event underlies the Homeric tradition, Blegan argues, it belongs here. His 4-volume publication, appearing between 1950 and 1958, becomes the foundational reference for all subsequent work at the site. But Blegan's Troy remains essentially a citadel, a fortified hilltop of modest extent. The transformation in understanding comes decades later. In 1988, Manfred Kaufmann of the University of Tübingen launches a new campaign armed with tools Blegan never possessed: magnetometry, resistivity surveys, satellite imaging. The geophysical results are startling. South and east of the citadel, beneath agricultural fields that had been ploughed for centuries, the instruments reveal a dense pattern of walls, streets, and structures extending across approximately 30 hectares. A lower town protected by a rock-cut ditch nearly 3 meters deep and originally fronted by a wooden palisade. Troy is not a small hilltop fortress. It is a substantial Bronze Age city, comparable in extent to contemporary sites across Anatolia and the Aegean. Population estimates leap from a few hundred to perhaps 7 or even 10,000 inhabitants at the city's peak. Kaufmann's excavations, continuing until his death in 2005, uncover workshops, storage facilities, and domestic structures in the lower town. They reveal a city embedded in long-distance trade networks stretching from the Black Sea coast to Egypt, from Hittite Hattusa to Mycenaean Tiryns. In 1998, the site receives inscription on the UNESCO World Heritage List, recognizing its extraordinary cultural significance. The debates persist. Some scholars question whether the lower town was as densely settled as Kaufmann proposed. Others argue that the destruction of Troy 7a reflects local conflict rather than a Mycenaean expedition. The relationship between the Iliad and the archaeological record remains genuinely unresolved, a productive tension rather than a failure of evidence. What the stones confirm is that a real city stood here, substantial and strategically vital, and that it burned violently at a date broadly consistent with Greek tradition. The mound endures. Turkish excavation and conservation programs continue under the direction of Rüstem Aslan. Walking the site today, the layers are visible in exposed sections, dark bands of ash separating courses of mud brick and limestone. The walls of Troy 6 still stand in places to 5 meters, their battered limestone faces catching the late afternoon light. The Scamander Plain stretches westward toward the Dardanelles, where container ships now pass through the same strait that Bronze Age traders navigated in oared galleys. In the museums of Istanbul and Kanakkale, loom weights and gold earrings and grey Anatolian bowls rest in glass cases, small objects carrying the weight of 3,000 years of continuous human presence on a single hill. The wind moves across the mound as it has always moved. The stones hold what they hold. And the city that was Troy, built, burned, rebuilt, forgotten, and found again, still asks the question it has always asked. What endures, and what do we choose to remember? Thank you for joining this journey through the deep past. If these stories of the ancient world have moved you, consider subscribing so you never miss the next expedition into the city's time left behind.